On October 25, 2012, New York City was rocked by one of the most horrific and tragic crimes in its history. On this day, in the prestigious Upper West Side neighborhood of Manhattan, there was a double murder of two young children, 6 and 2-year-olds Lucia and Leo Krim. The crime was committed by their nanny, 50-year-old Yoselyn Ortega, to whom the Krim family trusted the most precious thing, the life and safety of their children. This murder caused a wave of shock and horror, stirring up the general public across the country. The event has become particularly acute in the context of the trusting relationship that usually develops between parents and nannies. The Krim family, like many others in New York, relied on a professional to care for their children, unaware that trust could turn into a nightmare. The case has exacerbated issues related to the safety and psychological stability of people working with children, prompting the need for more careful monitoring of those who trust children. On this day, the usual trip of the mother, Marina Krim, with her third daughter to a swimming lesson ended with a terrible discovery that changed their lives forever. Returning to her apartment, Marina discovered a terrible scene. Her children were brutally murdered, and their nanny was lying in the bathroom with cut wounds, allegedly trying to commit suicide. Police and investigators soon arrived at the scene, and Yoselyn Ortega was immediately detained. Her double murder charge was the beginning of a long trial. Autumn Manhattan is a time when nature and the city merge into a harmonious picture. The trees in Central Park shine with gold and crimson, and the streets are covered with a carpet of fallen leaves. The cool autumn air brings with it a feeling of comfort and tranquility. Residents and tourists enjoy this beauty, strolling along the avenues and cozy streets. Marina Krim, an Upper West Side resident and mother of 3, picked up her eldest daughter, Lucia, from school, and then went with the youngest, 3-year-old Nessa, to a swimming lesson at a local pool. Meanwhile, her son Leo, who recently turned 2, stayed at home under the supervision of their nanny, Yoselyn Ortega. It was a common practice for the family to entrust the children to Yoselyn, with whom they had been working for 2 years. No one could have imagined that this day would end with one of the most terrible tragedies in their lives.
A mother coming home to find 2 of her children stabbed.
When Marina and Nessa returned home around 5:30 p.m., she expected to see Lucia and Leo, as usual, playing under Ortega's supervision. However, the door of their apartment was locked. The unusual silence alerted the woman. She knocked on the door several times but received no answer. At some point, she managed to open the door, and then she was faced with a silence that seemed ominous. Marina began to inspect the apartment in search of children. Finding no one at home, she went down several floors to check with the concierge if the babysitter had left with the children. The concierge replied that he had not seen any of them coming out. Surprised by the response of the employee of the residential complex, Marina returns to the apartment to recheck all the rooms.
When the mother returned home, she discovered the bodies of her 2 children in the bathtub.
When the bathroom door opened, a terrifying scene appeared before her eyes. Her children were lying in the bathtub, bloodied and motionless. The babysitter was sitting next to them with a bloody kitchen knife in her hands. Seeing her mother's reaction, the nanny stabbed herself twice in the throat. Marina was scared and ran out of the apartment with her daughters screaming in horror. At that moment, Marina let out a desperate cry. "Why? Why did you do that?" One of the neighbors, hearing her crying and screaming, immediately called an ambulance and the police. Later, the building's concierge said that a woman ran out of the apartment with her youngest daughter in her arms, screaming and begging for help. The police arrived at the scene just a few minutes later. Medical workers immediately took the injured to the hospital, but upon arrival they diagnosed the death of both children. 6-year-old Lucia and 2-year-old Leo were killed by multiple stab wounds. Nanny Yoselyn Ortega, being seriously injured, was promptly taken to the hospital, where doctors saved her life, although her wounds seemed quite deep and incomparable with life. At that time, Marina's husband was supposed to return from a business trip. Upon arrival, he received a voice message from his wife, who was shouting something incomprehensibly hysterically. He only realized that something had happened to the children. He was met at the airport by the police, who told him what had happened. The man fainted when he learned about the tragedy with the children. He was given first aid and taken to his wife in the hospital. The parents were devastated by the loss of their children. They could not imagine that a nanny, whom they considered practically a family member, could do something like this. It was a day that changed the Krim family forever. The psychological shock and grief experienced by the family was difficult to put into words. Lucia Krim, or Lulu, as her family affectionately called her, was a 6-year-old girl with a bright character and inextinguishable energy. She loved to draw, dance, and often showed her artwork to her parents. Marina recalled that Lulu was a very curious and friendly girl who easily found a common language with her peers. She had shiny long hair, which Marina often braided for her. Lulu loved spending time with her younger brother and sister, playing with them and taking care of them like a little adult. Her younger brother Leo, who was only 2 years old, was a fair-haired boy with clear eyes and a gentle nature. He was just starting to speak, mastering the first words and phrases. Leo was a real mom's son. He often spent time next to Marina, loved hugging and playing with cars. His parents liked to describe him as a little researcher because he always studied the world around him with interest. On the day of the murder, Leo stayed at home with a babysitter while his mother and younger sister went to swimming lessons. The Krim family was known in their area as friendly and caring. They often participated in activities for children, spent time in playgrounds, and played on the streets of the Upper West Side. This made the tragedy even more devastating for those who knew the family intimately. The dead children, who have not yet had time to really start their lives, have become a symbol of loss and shock for the entire district. Yoselyn Ortega, the family's nanny, was born in 1962 in the Dominican Republic. She was the youngest of Ortega's large family. She had 8 siblings. Yoselyn grew up in a relatively well-off family. Her parents owned a wine cellar and made good money to support a large family. The family was loving. They all took care of each other. The children did not know the difficulties until adolescence, when suddenly one of her sisters died. This event had a strong impact on all family members, but especially on Yoselyn. She stayed at home for about a year and was depressed, missing her sister. From that moment on, she began to hear voices in her head that made her hurt others, but she didn't tell anyone about it, only some of the sisters, and asked them to keep it a secret. For a long time, almost no one knew about it, even the parents. Of course, they noticed some oddities in Yoselyn's behavior, but they attributed it to frustration over her sister's death. Over time, Yoselyn learned to move on and not succumb to the provocations of voices. After graduating from high school, she went to university, where she studied to be an accountant. Studying was difficult for her, given her condition, but nevertheless in 1985 she was able to successfully graduate from the university. After graduating, Yoselyn decides to move to New York, where one of her sisters already lived. The girls began to live together, they worked and paid for housing. In 1995, Yoselyn falls in love with a young man and gets married. A year later, a son is born in a young family, who was named Jesus. But soon after the birth of the child, the relationship between the spouses deteriorated, and in 1999 the couple decided to divorce, despite all attempts to save the marriage. A young girl is left alone with a small child in her arms. There was not enough money, so she made a decision and took her 4-year-old son to be raised by her parents, and she returned to the United States, where she could earn more money for herself and for the child. Having saved up enough money, in March 2008, the woman returned to her homeland to raise her son. In April of the same year, a close friend of Yoselyn shot himself on his balcony. After learning about the tragedy, the woman fell into a deep depression and was knocked out of her rut again. She became terribly paranoid and did not leave the house, and also forbade her son to go to school. After a while, when the situation returned to normal, Yoselyn came to her senses. She went back to work in the United States with her sister, leaving her son with her parents. Later, the woman met the rich Krim family, who were looking for a babysitter for their children. Kevin Krim, the father of the family, was a Harvard graduate, and his wife Marina is a graduate of Southern California University. The couple met through friends at an Italian restaurant and immediately liked each other. They got married in 2003. In 2006, their first daughter, Lucia, was born, and then their second daughter, Nessie. When Marina became pregnant with her 3rd child, the family moved from California to New York because of Kevin's job to one of the best neighborhoods in Manhattan, just a block from Central Park on the Upper West Side. Due to the need for assistance in caring for young children, the couple hires Yoselyn Ortega as a nanny. At the time of the crime, Yoselyn was 50 years old, and she had been living and working in New York for several years. Before becoming a nanny in the Krim family, Yoselyn worked for other families and even brought her son from the Dominican Republic to give him the opportunity to study and live in the United States. To many, she seemed like an ordinary working woman who was striving to provide for her family. The Krim family hired Yoselyn about 2 years before the tragedy. They liked her immediately. She was open, friendly, and immediately established contact with the children. Quiet, hardworking, neat, and caring, Yoselyn seemed to be a perfect match for their family. Marina and her husband Kevin treated her very well. They gave her expensive gifts and even bought her tickets to the Dominican Republic so that she could visit her family. Later, the Krim family helped Yoselyn move her son Jesus to the United States. The teenager had to be placed in a private school, as he was not accepted into a regular school. This has become an additional financial burden for Yoselyn. But the most difficult thing was ahead of them. In April 2012, Yoselyn and her son are kicked out of their rented apartment in the Bronx. They have to return to the cramped apartment of relatives, where 6 other people lived in addition to them. Yoselyn asks the Krim family for additional earnings and a salary increase so that they and their son can rent an apartment again. The Krim family decide to help the woman and raise her salary for additional housework. They also paid good money to her son for sometimes walking their 2 dogs. In an attempt to solve her financial difficulties, Yoselyn starts selling cosmetics and jewelry to her neighbors, and she did it perfectly. Things went well until the moment when one of the friends decides to take a large batch of jewelry for resale and disappears along with the goods. The whole amount fell on the shoulders of Yoselyn. The woman decides to take an additional part-time job. Marina, knowing the nanny's problems, begins to recommend her to her friends so that she can earn more. But this only angered the woman more. The exhausted woman believed that the Krims could have paid her more. The grudges from the nanny were accumulating every day. Sister Yoselyn noticed that she began to pray at home often and read religious magazines. She immediately suspected a deterioration in her mental state, and turned out to be right. Yoselyn had auditory and visual hallucinations again. She didn't sleep well and saw some demons. She turned to a psychologist but hid this fact from the Krim family, in fear of losing her job. At the same time, her relationship with members of the Krim family was straining. Marina said that Yoselyn had looked tired, depressed, and nervous in recent months. In the house where she lived with her relatives, relations were also strained, which worsened her condition. However, neither her family nor her friends could have imagined that her condition could lead to such tragic consequences. After the police arrived at the scene, one of the most intensive investigations in the history of the Upper West Side began. The case gained wide public attention, and every detail was carefully checked by investigators. The officers immediately realized that they were dealing with a particularly brutal crime, and began collecting evidence that could shed light on what happened and determine the motives for the murder.
Who apparently had inflicted wounds on her throat.
When the police arrived at the scene, Yoselyn Ortega was found in a semi-conscious state. She was seriously injured. Deep cuts on her neck and wrists indicated a suicide attempt. Paramedics treated her urgently and took her to the hospital, where doctors saved her life, despite serious injuries. From the very first minutes, Ortega became the main suspect in the double murder case. While Yoselyn was in the hospital under the supervision of doctors and police, investigators began to inspect the apartment. The murder weapon, a kitchen knife with bloodstains, was found near the crime scene. It became a key piece of evidence, as Ortega's fingerprints and the blood of both children were found on it. Investigators also examined signs of a struggle, of which there were few. This meant that the children did not expect an attack. They were probably in a calm state until the very moment of death. A pathoanatomical study showed that the death of the children occurred from multiple stab wounds, which indicated a special cruelty and premeditation of the crime. In the house where the Krim family lived, surveillance cameras were installed in public areas such as lobbies and corridors. These cameras captured the moments when Marina Krim left the apartment with her youngest daughter, as well as returning back after class. The video also showed that Yoselyn Ortega did not leave the apartment with the children at that time. During the first days after the crime, Ortega remained in the hospital under medical supervision. She was in a state of depression and disorientation, which made it difficult to establish contact with her. When questioned by investigators about her actions, Yoselyn answered haltingly or was completely silent.
Year-old nanny survived the wounds to her throat, and this morning police say she's in critical but stable condition at a nearby hospital. Yoselyn Ortega.
As soon as the suspect was brought to consciousness, on November 3rd, detectives with the participation of a Spanish translator began asking her questions. They learned some details of what happened. Yoselyn did not admit to the murder but told investigators that she felt resentment towards the family because her parents often made remarks to her and pointed out what needed to be done. Refusing the presence of a lawyer, she admitted that she was in the bathroom at the time of the crime, but did not admit that she stabbed children. Then she added that the children's mother, Marina, knows why this happened. Sister Yoselyn later told investigators that on the eve of the terrible tragedy, there was a small conflict between her and Marina because the nanny fed the children unhealthy food, and this was fundamentally important for the family. Perhaps this situation was the trigger for Yoselyn, who was going through hard times. Nevertheless, investigators turned to psychologists and psychiatrists to conduct an expert assessment of her condition. The investigation revealed signs of deep depression and chronic stress that could have played a role in the events of that day. However, the key question remained, was Ortega sane at the time of the murder, or did her mental state completely exclude her conscious guilt? Ortega's psychiatric examination revealed a number of serious abnormalities. Specialists diagnosed her with severe depression and signs of a psychotic disorder. According to psychiatrists, Yoselyn was in a depressed state for a long time, which could be aggravated by a feeling of hopelessness and powerlessness. One of the key issues was establishing Ortega's sanity at the time of the crime. Psychiatrists noted that she could have periods of breakdown when she lost control of her actions. On November 13th, the first trial of Yoselyn Ortega began. The woman was charged with first-degree murder of children, which she continued to deny, and hired a lawyer. At that time, the death penalty had already been abolished in New York, which means that the nanny was only facing life imprisonment. A psychiatric examination found her sane and able to stand trial. Further, the trial will last for more than 5 years. About 90 court sessions were held in the case. The defendant's side constantly postponed meetings due to health problems of the accused, thereby delaying the trial. During the trial, Yoselyn Ortega refused to make a deal with the prosecution, who offered her 30 years in prison in exchange for a guilty plea. This would have allowed her to be released at the age of just over 80. Ortega refused to give any evidence regarding the motives of the crime and gave lawyers the opportunity to defend themselves. The defense insisted that the defendant's mental illness was to blame for everything and provided the conclusions of 2 psychiatrists. They stated that Ms. Ortega had heard voices, including satanic ones, ordering her to kill herself and the children. They claimed she had been suffering from hallucinations since she was a teenager, but her illness had not been treated or diagnosed before. She lost her temper and just couldn't control herself at the time of the stabbing. Family members of the defendant in their testimony said that a few weeks before the murder, Yoselyn's behavior changed. She began to see demons, shadows, and people who were chasing her. To make these hallucinations go away, she threw pots and pans on the kitchen floor and walls to drown out the voices in her head. Sometimes she even banged her head against the wall to exorcise the demons from her head. The defendant's sisters accused the Krim family of exploiting her and not giving her rest, which served to aggravate her mental state. They said that Marina bullied her and publicly humiliated her for refusing to go to their friend's house for cleaning, because of which Yoselyn cried for a long time in the park. Her work schedule was constantly changing, and Yoselyn often missed visits to the doctor, which, according to lawyers, had a bad effect on her psycho-emotional state. The psychotherapist who saw Ortega was also questioned. He reported that she had anxiety states, but he did not observe any signs of schizophrenia. When recordings of appointments with a psychologist were listened to in court, Ortega really did not say anything about the voices in her head that were bothering her. A visiting psychiatrist for the prosecution also ruled out signs of psychosis and noted that she could only have had fits of rage, and she was trying to simulate a state of psychosis. At the trial, one of the Yoselyn family members said that she was jealous of the Krim family, who could provide for all their children, while Yoselyn and his son were making ends meet.
Other 2 children stabbed to death. The nanny she trusted with their lives will soon be charged with taking them.
The trial of Yoselyn Ortega began in March 2018 and has become one of the most anticipated and discussed in New York. The horrific murder of 2 young children caused a wide public outcry, and the process itself promised to be dramatic and emotionally stressful. The main question facing the court was whether Ortega was sane at the time of the crime, or whether her actions could be explained by deep mental disorders. Yoselyn Ortega's lawyers based their defense on the claim that their client suffered from severe psychosis and depression, which made her insane at the time of the murders. The defense tried to prove that Ortega was unaware of her actions when she attacked the children, and that her mental disorder developed over many months, which eventually led to the tragedy. The main witnesses in court were Marina and Kevin Krim, the parents of the murdered children. Their testimony was filled with deep pain and sorrow, which made the process especially emotional. Marina Krim described that day in detail. She talked about every step she took from the moment she walked up to the apartment door to the moment she discovered the horrific scene in the bathroom. "When I opened the door, it was too quiet," Marina recalled. "I went into the apartment, and there was no sound anywhere. I immediately felt that something was wrong." Her voice trembled as she recalled the screams that escaped her when she saw the bodies of her children and their babysitter lying next to them. In her last speech, the grief-stricken mother addressed the accused and said that she could not destroy their happy family, which they had built so hard, but instead destroyed only her own. Soon, the couple had 2 more young sons. The prosecutors concluded their statement by stating that Yoselyn Ortega killed 2 innocent children in cold blood and with calculation. She understood what she was doing and should be held accountable for her actions. They relied on the fact that the crime was carefully planned because the night before, Yoselyn returned home, talked to her sister and asked her to take care of Jesus as her own son. Sister agreed, not understanding what Yoselyn was up to at the time. The former nanny said goodbye to her son before he left for school. She left her sister an envelope containing her personal documents and cash. The prosecutor believed that in this way the defendant said goodbye to her family, knowing that she would not return. The father of the murdered children asked the judge to sentence the accused to the maximum penalty to ensure that the defendant will never be able to get out of prison. They didn't see any remorse in her and thought it would be fair if she waited, rotted, and died in a concrete cage. The prosecutor supported her father's wishes and called on the judge to sentence her to life in prison without the right to parole. Yoselyn Ortega herself last appeared before the court with a short statement in which she did not justify her actions but expressed regret. "I apologize for everything that happened and for everything that I did."
As he learned, a jury found his former nanny, Yoselyn Ortega, guilty of killing his 6-year-old daughter, Lucia, and 2-year-old son, Leo.
After several weeks of intense litigation, in which the testimony of the family, experts, and eyewitnesses was heard, the court came to its final stage. In April 2018, the jury was supposed to make a decision that would put an end to this high-profile case. The jury deliberation took several hours. Tension grew in the courtroom when it became known that the jury had reached a consensus. On April 18, 2018, Yoselyn Ortega was found guilty of all charges, including 2 counts of first-degree premeditated murder and 2 counts of second-degree murder.
For the horrific slayings of Leo and Lulu Krim, convicting her of 2 counts of murder in the first degree.
In May 2018, the judge supported the jury's opinion and announced the verdict: life imprisonment without parole. Yoselyn Ortega was sentenced to 2 life sentences, 1 for each murdered child. This meant that she would spend the rest of her life in prison without having a chance to be released. At sentencing, Judge Gregory Caro expressed regret for the incident, calling the crime one of the most monstrous and terrible that has ever had to be considered in this court. He stressed that the murder of 2 young children is not just a terrible crime, but also a tragedy that has left an indelible mark on the hearts of everyone who knew the Krim family. When the verdict was announced, the courtroom was filled with an emotional reaction. The Krim family, who attended the verdict, burst into tears. "We are grateful for the justice that has been restored today," said Kevin Krim, the father of the murdered children, speaking to the press after the verdict was announced. However, neither for him nor for his wife Marina, the verdict could bring back their children. The court decision caused a wide public reaction. For many New Yorkers, this process has become a symbol of the loss of security and trust in people who trust their children. In the city and beyond, many parents who used the services of nannies began to more seriously check the specialists they trust their children with. The public sympathized with the Krim family, and many expressed supports, offering help and condolences. At the same time, discussions began on how to prevent similar tragedies in the future. Against the background of the Ortega case, the issue of the need to tighten the procedures for hiring nannies, including mandatory psychological checks and monitoring of their condition during work, was raised. Parents began to pay more attention not only to the professional experience of the nanny, but also to her mental and emotional state. The murder of Lucia and Leo Krim by their nanny, Yoselyn Ortega, has become one of the most shocking and tragic crimes that have happened in New York in recent decades. This case highlighted not only the horrific consequences of mental disorders, but also the importance of checking those whom parents trust most dearly, their children. During several years of investigation and trial, the Society has been following the development of events, hoping to understand how an ordinary nanny could turn into a murderer and what can be done to avoid a repeat of such tragedies in the future. This case has become a painful reminder of the fragility of the human psyche and how slight disregard for mental health can lead to irreversible consequences. The tragedy of Lucia and Leo Krim left an indelible mark on the memory of their parents, friends, and all those who followed this case, and became a symbol of the need to take care of mental health and the importance of responsibility when choosing those who work with children.